Welcome, everyone. If you want to, while we wait for everyone to join, if you want to toss in the chat who you are and where you're from, that would be great. It would help us know you can hear us. Welcome, everyone. If you want to toss in the chat who you are and where you're from while we just kind of keep waiting for everyone else to join. We got Illinois, Penn State, Kansas Department of Ag, Nebraska. Hi, Mark. It's great. Welcome, everyone. Maine, Iowa, California. This is great. Cornell, South Carolina, Chicago, lots of Kansas, Georgia. Welcome, everyone. Texas, Michigan, other Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico. Nashville, Idaho, Minnesota, Utah. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, feel free if you're still joining, toss in the chat who you are and where you're from. While we wait for everyone to join. Nigeria, New York, Arizona. Hawaii, look at that. Kansas, more Kansas, this is great. Welcome, everyone. Tennessee. Yes, this presentation will be recorded and sent out to everyone who's registered. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the 5th webinar in our International IPM Symposium series. The International IPM Symposium occurs every 3 years. The 11th International IPM Symposium, Pest Management in Changing Environments, is slated for March 3rd through 6th, 2025 in San Diego, California. The vision for this event is to bring together top IPM professionals from industry and academia and agriculture, public health, structural environments, landscape, and forestry to make the 2025 edition an unparalleled networking and professional development event for attendees around the world. At the end of today's webinar, we'll share more details on how you can get involved with or attend the IPM Symposium. But for now, I want to introduce our guest speaker today, Al Fournier, who will be speaking on the Endangered Species Act and EPA, what's changing and why. Al is an Associate Extension Specialist in Entomology based at the Maricopa Agricultural Center in Arizona. As IPM Program Manager and Associate Director of the Arizona Pest Management Center, he supports needs assessment, planning, evaluation, and reporting for the University of Arizona IPM programs, serving agronomic and specialty crops, urban and tribal communities, and public health priorities. The goal of the center is to support the faculty in their efforts to develop and deliver outstanding IPM programs that address the needs of Arizona citizens. One focus of the program is to educate and engage stakeholders around issues related to IPM and federal pest management policy decisions that impact the environment and human health. This focus includes education, outreach, and expert testimony that support the economic interests of Arizona agriculture and community pest management, while protecting human health and environment, as well as educating on reducing pesticide risks to broad audiences. His expertise is in entomology, and the evaluation of IPM adoption, implementation, and impact. Thank you for joining us today, Al, and I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you, Marnie, and hopefully folks are seeing my screen here. All right, good. And I think you wanted to say a word about the symposium, or did you already cover that? I guess you covered that, huh?
Yep, I'll cover a little more at the end.
Yeah, but
Thank
look
you.
at the pictures, folks. Doesn't that look like a place you want to go? All right.
A nice place for March.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone being here. I want to thank the committee for inviting me in to talk on this topic today. I think it's pretty important, and people will be starting to see the impact of some of these changes in the near future. So let me go back and just say, today I'm going to be telling you about EPA's new strategic approach for addressing endangered species in its future pesticide actions. And as part of that, I'm going to highlight some of the ways that this is going to impact growers. Now, my focus is going to be on agriculture. And the reason for that is that EPA's initial efforts in terms of kind of determining their strategies and how they're going to be implementing things differently to be more protective of listed species, that's all really happening on the agricultural front initially. And I think for other outdoor pesticide uses, you will eventually see some impact as well. But my focus today will be on agriculture. And then I'm going to wrap up at the end by talking about some of the impacts of my program in terms of influencing federal pesticide policy. And that's a collaborative effort in the Western region that I'm a part of, and as well as sharing some resources related to pesticide registration, review, and the Endangered Species Act. But I want to start today by talking about why. Why is EPA changing the way that they're doing things with respect to endangered species? So the Endangered Species Act has been around for a long time, really since 1973, and it's administered by the by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And basically, all other federal agencies need to be compliant with it, every individual and organization. And it's a very strict and tight standard that they have. And I want to go back because I mean to introduce you to the Sonoran pronghorn. So this is a subspecies of American pronghorn that's only found in Arizona, and it runs across a swath of our counties, including many of our agricultural counties. I'm going to try to introduce you to a few of the players on that endangered species list as we go through here. So the Environmental Protection Agency, of course, they've been around since 1970, and the Office of Pesticide Policy under FIFRA is responsible for pesticide registration, and they need to make sure that those actions ensure no unreasonable adverse effects to human health and the environment. They do this when pesticides are initially registered. There's certain risk assessments that are used to determine, the label, the information that needs to go on the label to be protective of users and so forth. But what you may or may not know is they also conduct pesticide registration reviews. They've been mandated to do this since around 2013. And that means looking at every currently registered active ingredient, running new risk assessments for human health and the environment. So EPA has gone through one entire cycle of registration review, and they've looked at nearly 700 different active ingredients through that process. One of the issues is that all during that time, they've been getting sued again and again. They found themselves in court. And one of the reasons they're usually ending up in court is because the Endangered Species Act has really given litigants who have all different kinds of interests a toehold to sue EPA. So I want to share with you just some quotes from some decisions. These are all pretty recent from late 2022. And I'm just going to read these as we go through. Before registering a pesticide, EPA must consult with the statutorily specified agencies that have expertise on risk to species survival. But for decades, EPA routinely skipped that step when it registered pesticides. EPA has had a fraught relationship with the Endangered Species Act. It has made a habit of registering pesticides without making the required effects determinations. That means the effects on listed species. And finally, it's deja vu all over again. EPA comes before this court once more because of its failure to abide by the law. EPA cannot flout the will of Congress and of the people just because it thinks it's too busy or understaffed. So EPA has really been raked over the coals on this, and one way to understand this is to look at the different regulatory standards across the different agencies. I already mentioned that for EPA under FIFRA, no unreasonable adverse effects, right, to human health or the environment. The standard's a little higher for human health because they also have to comply with the Food Quality Protection Act under FDA, which indicates a reasonable certainty of no harm, and that's harm to human health. FIFRA standard allows EPA a little bit of leeway in order to consider the benefits of pesticides when they're making decisions that are related to environmental impacts on environmental issues. But when it comes to human health, they have far less leeway, as I've seen that in the comments that we've submitted and the responses from EPA. Now, the Endangered Species Act, it has the highest standard of all of these, and I'm just going to read a passage from it here to you. It is unlawful for any person, including private and public entities, to take individuals of an endangered species. To take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, kill, wound, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So that pretty much covers it. And then jeopardy means actions that jeopardize the continued existence of that species or a population of that species. So the standard for ESA, Endangered Species Act, is no take and no jeopardy. Now, as I mentioned, it's the services, these two services that are responsible for ensuring compliance with other federal agencies like EPA. So EPA is required to go through a consultation process with these services on all of its pesticide actions. And that's really where they've been falling short. Now, there are some reasons for that. And, I kind of have a lot of sympathy for EPA understanding their processes and the difficulty of this. But these bullets on this slide are from the draft herbicide strategy that came out in 2023. And this is by EPA's own admission. They identified that it takes 4 to 12 years to complete the consultation process on a single active ingredient. Remember, I mentioned there's almost 700 active ingredients that went through registration review in the most recent cycle. And for each of those, they need to look at potential impacts on over 1,300 listed species. And so it's not a small task. EPA estimates that they would complete all the Endangered Species Act work by 2040, but that's just for the pesticides that are currently under litigation. I say currently, I mean at the time that they noted this slide in July of last year. That would take them till 2040. Those are just the ones they're being sued for, and that represents only 5% of their obligations. So the problem here is the way that EPA has done things has been very scientific. They've looked at one active ingredient at a time, and in doing that, they've ensured that they're really looking at the science of that chemistry and how it impacts things. But they haven't always done that endangered species side because of the time-consuming nature of getting through everything with the services. So they're kind of at the mercy of the services there. So EPA's solution, their new approach, is to advance pesticide mitigations that are going to reduce risks to all non-target species and to listed species ahead of the consultation process. So they're going to be making their own determinations about potential impacts on listed species before that official process with the services is complete. And they're going to implement those changes on the labels. Just from this why section, hopefully it's kind of apparent why EPA is doing this. There really need to be in better compliance with the Endangered Species Act. In January 2021, EPA had nearly 24 lawsuits against it, and due to its longstanding failure to meet its obligations for ESA. And some of these lawsuits resulted in the courts removing pesticides from the market. This happened, it was a real thing. It happened with our growers with chlorpyrifos. It happened earlier with sulfoxaflor. And this is a problem. And one of EPA's goals in taking this new approach is to reduce that uncertainty for pesticide users. Now, as I mentioned, all this is part of a broader EPA work plan to proactively protect endangered species. And this fellow on your screen is the black-footed ferret, and it's the only ferret species that's native to the Americas. And I'll bet you didn't know this. The earliest fossil record of the black-footed ferret goes back 100,000 years. And all of the populations of this critter in the US, and there are some in Arizona and some other Western states, they're all the result of reintroduction efforts. So let's take a look at EPA's strategic approach. And I've tried to boil it down. This is kind of a high-level view. And here's just kind of an overview of what was covered in that work plan that came out in 2022. This is EPA's work plan for protecting endangered species. So it's a comprehensive and long-term approach to meeting their obligations. And they're going to plan to expedite pesticide reviews and species protection simultaneously. Now, up until now, those have been sort of separate processes, really disparate processes. EPA, on the one hand, does their registration review where they're really just looking at the human health and environmental concerns right around the field, but haven't done the further analysis to determine impacts on listed species. That's a separate process that EPA goes through and a separate consultation process with the services. But now EPA is taking that, they're taking those two things together. So as they go through registration review, they're also making their own determinations about impacts on listed species. They're going to prioritize their pesticide reviews to put the riskiest pesticides at the front of the new cycle of pesticide review. It started around the end of 2022. They started going back through all the currently registered chemistries, and they're looking at a lot of those most concerning ones up front. So that's what it means by they're reducing risk. They're looking at the riskiest things first. And secondly, they're trying to maximize their efficiency. And you saw some examples of this maybe if you're aware of, for example, they've looked at pyrethroids as a group in terms of their environmental effects. They did ecological risk assessments for, I think, 14 different pyrethroids. Now, there's some diversity in those chemistries, but in doing that, they were able to look at the potential impacts and identify potential mitigations. Sometimes they were different from one active ingredient to another, but they got through 14 chemistries all in one shot by doing it that way. You saw a similar thing if you're in the urban market. You probably know about the rodenticide changes for the anticoagulants. They looked at those as a group. So there's going to be a greater emphasis on addressing ecological risks, including risks to endangered species. And the biggest change of all really is in this last bullet, and this is what people will notice. EPA needed to figure out a plan for how they're going to implement geographically specific protections. As you probably realize, most of these endangered and threatened species are in those categories because they're not everywhere. They're not starlings, they're not pigeons. They are often in very limited habitats. And so the ability to use a chemistry everywhere that these species are not, EPA, of course, wanted to maintain that flexibility. So they've got a plan for how they're going to implement that, which I'll share with you. So in addition to the work plan that I just mentioned, EPA has developed a whole series of strategies. And the ones that I have on this slide is only a partial list of these. But these strategy documents kind of get down into the nitty-gritty of how EPA is making the determinations of risks to listed species, and they identify the mitigations that are needed in order to protect those species. So the two examples I want to point out in a little more detail, the herbicide strategy, it came out in draft form in July 2023. And like many other entities, the Arizona Pest Management Center, we got a lot of information and feedback from stakeholders. We submitted comments on this. And then the final version came out just in August of 2024. EPA made a lot of changes to their plan based on input from stakeholders between that draft and final version of the herbicide strategy. And right around the same time in July of 2024, the draft insecticide strategy came out. What I want you to understand is that the mitigations that EPA's identified and that I'm going to talk about in the coming slides, um, those are those are literally the same between the final herbicide strategy and the draft insecticide strategy. What I mean by that is what EPA has learned in that first strategy, they've implemented and they're integrating those lessons, those comments from stakeholders into the insecticide strategy. There's a fungicide strategy that's due to come out around the end of December. And that obviously, whatever comments they get on the insecticide strategy, whatever refinements or changes are made, will probably be reflected in that fungicide strategy. So there is a public commenting process that is informing all of this. So now what we're looking at is we're delving into the herbicide strategy a little bit. And the way these strategies are done is EPA identified a number of chemistries that they wanted to do case studies for. So in this case, they looked at 12 different herbicides, and these are pretty diverse herbicides in terms of how they move in the environment, their toxicity and their actions and so forth. And so that diversity is very intentional. The other thing is these are about the 12 most commonly used herbicides in agriculture. So they represent a huge portion of all herbicide use nationally. I forget what the number is, but I think it's over 90%. So by looking at these individual chemistries in great detail and identifying the potential risks to listed species for each of these chemistries, they came up with a set of mitigations broadly, like across all these 12 kind of herbicides. What are the types of mitigations that would help to reduce exposures and therefore would help to protect listed species and other non-targets? So it's basically a three-step method. They first determined the potential for population level impacts. And I want to emphasize there were a huge number of refinements between the draft herbicide strategy and the final herbicide strategy. Their analysis for this step one was much better informed by more detailed scientific information and didn't rely on as many sort of conservative assumptions. And so they're getting better each time through the cycle with this. They're getting a little better at it. In step two, any of those active ingredients in step one where they've identified those population level impacts, they then need to identify, well, what mitigations are needed. And those are mostly focused on reducing spray drift, soil erosion, and runoff. And then the third step is to identify where mitigations would apply. Would they be broad, all across the country, or would they be only in those areas nearby where the listed species are located? So that's a pretty short summary of a lot of information at a very high level, but that's kind of the basis of these strategies. And I want to take a look now at how this is expected to then impact growers on the ground. So there's two different approaches to how EPA would implement these pesticide mitigations, right? So the first are broad protections, and those are just going to appear on the general label. And those would apply to everyone using the chemical. And then we're going to talk about those first, and then we'll talk about the geographic specific protections. So it's all about keeping the chemical on the field. So this kind of breaks down into two categories of mitigations to achieve that. Downwind spray buffers and something called a runoff and erosion mitigation menu. So I'm going to talk about the spray buffers first. But again, EPA's philosophy with this is that by keeping the chemistry on the field where it's supposed to be and eliminating as much as possible of that drift and runoff, they're protective of all non-target species that are outside the field. And that's also at the same time protective of listed species if they're in an area. So let me go back and highlight here the downwind spray buffers. The focus here is on protecting unmanaged downwind areas. I'm going to explain what that means. In the draft herbicide strategy, EPA focused on specific habitats. And one of the main comments they got from a lot of growers was, so if you're near this habitat, then you need to do these mitigations. That was how it was kind of worded before. But one of the problems was that growers and others said, we don't always really know. There's a natural area over there, but we don't know if it's one of the protected areas or not based on EPA's definition. We may not always have that knowledge. So EPA tried to simplify this in a way by saying, instead of focusing on, well, what type of habitat is that that's near me, they're focusing on managed areas. Now, managed areas are all those areas where humans are very active. So it's the farm itself. It could be roads. It could be other fields, buildings, irrigation canals. Conservation Reserve Program lands are considered managed lands. On-farm managed wetlands would be another example. So those areas are managed areas, and it's not expected that there would be much chance of exposure to listed species in those areas. So the idea is if a pesticide requires a spray drift buffer to be protective of non-targets, then that spray drift buffer can be reduced by factoring in those managed lands into the equation. The other way those buffers can be reduced is by adopting some other mitigations, such as, well, you're going to use a hooded sprayer, or you're going to use a lower rate if that's an option. You would actually be able to reduce the size of the buffer by a certain percentage by adopting some of these practices. So to show you how this looks, this is a figure from the final herbicide strategy. Here you've got a natural area, and here you've got the farm. And in between, you've got a couple of things. There's a 20-foot windbreak here. Now, windbreaks are good. They're going to help to contain that spray drift, and they can be factored in. If they meet the certain requirements, they can be factored in. So there's 20 feet there, and then there's 10 feet of CRP land here. So there's 30 feet here that fall into the category of, okay, you can reduce your buffer by 30 feet. So instead of a 50-foot buffer between between this edge of the field and this area, now we've got a 20-foot buffer. Now this grower could possibly reduce that even more by reducing the application rate, or one of these other methods. The mitigations for spray drift buffers are different depending on whether it's aerial, air blast, or ground application. So you'd have to look at, there's specific tables in the draft strategy that highlight those. But this information would all be on the label. All right, I'm trying to cruise through this here. So the second piece of this is the runoff and erosion mitigation menu. Here's the thing. Um, in order to use a pesticide, a grower is going to need to have a certain number of points. They're going to have to kind of earn points to use pesticides. Now, again, only if there's an impact that EPA identifies. Some pesticides will have 0 points that may be required, but others could be up to 9. So 9 is the maximum number of points they might need. They get those points. They're called mitigation relief points, and there's a number of different ways to get them. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit, give you some examples. So the first of these is that in their refined analysis for the final herbicide strategy, and this is also true in the insecticide strategy, EPA has identified done a very detailed analysis of runoff risk by county across the lower 48 states. And we're going to look at that in a second. If you're in a low runoff vulnerability county, you get points for that. Then there's this mitigation menu that it's pretty huge. It has 40 rows of different options that growers can select from. They may be practices that growers are already doing, and they see that, okay, well, I'm doing that, that's worth 2 points, and they add up points from that mitigation menu. And there's a couple of situations that are complete exemptions where if certain conditions are true, they wouldn't need any points at all. So This is the pesticide relief vulnerability. I'll say that again, the pesticide runoff vulnerability relief map. And just as you look at the slide, hopefully it's kind of self-explanatory, but based on their analysis, EPA has identified these different areas of high, medium, low, and very low vulnerability based on those colors there. And obviously, if you're one of these dark green areas, that's the highest potential for runoff at a county level. And so if you're in one of those counties, you have to achieve the full number of points identified for the pesticide in order to be able to use it. But if you're in one of the other colored counties, you get either 2, 3, or 6 points. So suppose I'm in Yuma County. We're fortunate in Arizona in that for very good reason, we have low runoff potential. We don't have much rainfall. We have very flat fields, usually that are laser leveled and other conditions. But if I'm in Yuma County, which is right here in the southwest corner of Arizona, I actually get the maximum of 6 points. So to use that 9-point pesticide, now I just need to come up with 3 more mitigation points. And how do you do that? You look at the mitigation menu. I want to mention so I don't forget. The mitigation menu is a living document. This is going to evolve over time. And EPA has said that the menu will be hosted on a website. So this information is something that's going to be outside the label that people are going to have to go and look at and identify. So it's definitely an extra step for people. What I list here is not at all a complete list of the different potential mitigation practices, but in parentheses, I show the number of points that are available. So just to give you a couple examples, if a grower participates in a conservation program, that's worth 2 points, the soil conservation program, or if they consult with experts, that's 1 point. They can do either or. If they keep track of their mitigations, they get a point for that. They can reduce rates, the area treated, sandy soils or a low slope. The growers get point for that. No-till or tillage reduction, and so on down the line. So there's a bunch of these different practices. Some of them may be practices people are already engaged in. I did a survey in connection with both the draft herbicide and draft insecticide strategies, and we have a pretty good idea of what are the practices that at least have a higher potential that, percentage of our growers are using them. And kind of my assessment is it's not always as bad as it looks. Where it's bad is in having to do the math and figure all of this out. But I don't know how it looks to people in other parts of the country and in different crops. For some, I think there's some real challenges here. So I mentioned earlier there's some exemptions to this runoff mitigation, and these are the 3 conditions that EPA mentions. So for cropping systems that have permanent berms, that's things like rice paddies and cranberry bogs and things like that, I think. There might be some other examples of this. Those do not require any points to use those pesticides. Same thing with irrigation tailwater runoff systems, as long as everything is completely contained, and subsurface drainage that's released into controlled structures. So again, the idea is as long as that chemical is not chemical applied to the field is not going off site. So yeah, those are the broad protections. So everything I just talked about is implemented on the pesticide label. Let's talk about the geographic specific part of this. Now, I have this slide because I've been showing this slide everywhere I go when I go out and talk with growers and pest control advisors, because for us, like anywhere, some guys have been using these pesticides for many years, but I say to people, take another look at your labels, right? Because as EPA goes through the pesticide registration review process, if they've examined endangered species and if they found an impact anywhere in the country, then this pesticide or this endangered species box is getting added to the pesticide label. And it has a website here. You see that? So if you see this label, you have to go to the website. And at the website, you'll find this interactive map. Now, this was pretty terrible about a year ago, and it didn't work really, really well, but it's gotten better. And I'm going to throw this QR code up here. If you want to try it on your phone while I'm talking, you can do that. It works pretty good on the phone. You would scan this, and then you'd get a little pop-up that says go to BLT mapping app. You'd have to click on that pop-up to go to the interactive website. And it has this interactive map, and you see these pink areas, right? These are called pesticide use limitation areas, or PULAs. So that's any geographic area where a pesticide impact on a listed species has been identified. And a PULA could be for a single pesticide and a single listed species, or it could be, multiple pesticides, or it could be multiple species. In the insecticide strategy, EPA has specifically identified they have some grouped PULAs. So here's a group of insects that we want to protect, and they share a similar habitat or something like that. And so these may represent more than one species that's being protected. Now, you don't see a lot of pink on this map. You see a lot of pink in New Mexico. You'd see a lot of pink up in the Central Valley of California if you could see it on the map here. But more pink is going to be added to this, folks, because right now you saw EPA has only done a proportion of the work on identifying these impacts to species. So as the impacts are identified, the PULAs will get added to this website. So what you do when you see that notice on the label, you've got to go in here and you can navigate to the location of your pesticide application, or you can list a zip code or a cross street, whatever you want to do. Put in the month and the year, and then put in the EPA registration product number, or the registration number for the product. And what you'll do is you'll get a 2-page endangered species bulletin that looks like this. So in this example, this is actually a slide from EPA. You can see these pink areas here. And if you're in the pink area, then this mitigation applies, right? Do not apply this product in the specified areas. That mitigation could be something different, and it'll be listed right here on the document. So that's how that works. Now, I tried this in Arizona for an application, and for this particular product, there were no PULAs in my area. And so you get a map that just doesn't have any of those pesticide use limitation areas, and you don't have to worry about it. But it says, please check back if you plan to apply your pesticide in an area outside the map view or in a month or year different than the one. Timing can be important because some of these species are migratory, right? So that can make a difference. Now, obviously, there's some challenges to implementation, and I'm just going to fly through these pretty quickly here. These are comments that we heard when we were collecting information to send to EPA on our draft strategy. So this is a lot of information options for growers to consider and to sort through and to figure out when they're looking to just take care of a pest problem. And so there's some concern about that. On the other side of the coin, EPA is trying to provide the maximum amount of flexibility because different cropping systems, different geographies, different mitigations would make sense and would be useful. But that's kind of the flip side of it. There's different factors that can affect different fields. So this is something that came up in our comments. Our growers, a lot of times they'll have leased land that's separated in different geographic places. But if they want to treat whiteflies because there's a major outbreak, typically they'd have a standard approach and they'd use the same approach. But it's possible they would not be able to get enough points for the main insecticide they wanted to use. And on some of those fields, they'd have the points, on some they wouldn't. So it complicates those spray operations. Even EPA admits, there's probably going to be some tools needed to help streamline and aid this implementation. EPA is trying to develop some of those tools on its own, and we haven't seen those yet. But I think that these are really going to have to be local solutions. So I think that cooperative extension is probably going to play a major role in helping growers at a local level to sort through all of this. In Arizona and California, where we have pesticide use reporting data, people use these data management systems. I don't know if this impacts other parts of the country in any way, but these systems are used by growers because they will enter all the details of their spray. And if they put in anything that's off label, they'll get a red flag come up. It won't let them submit the application. So they use these really for legal protection. And a lot of questions were raised about, well, gosh, more than a third of our growers are using these, and how are these going to incorporate these different changes for the spray drift and soil erosion runoff. But the biggest change on the surface for a lot of people is going to be this Bulletins Live 2. For the first time, pesticide users are going to have to go beyond the label, and they're going to have to go to other websites to get information, both for Bulletins Live 2 and for that mitigation menu that I mentioned. So I'm getting toward the end here. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly, but I want to share some resources with you, as well as some of our outcomes in our 19 now almost 20-year dialogue with EPA on these issues. So these are some endangered species resources if you want to take a look at these websites. So this is how you get to Bulletins Live 2. This is the same as what I showed on the other slide. This is called the Endangered Species Toolbox, but it mainly focuses on Bulletins Live 2 type resources for you. And this is the really the main homepage for Endangered Species Act at EPA, and you can get to all kinds of stuff from there. There's even like activities for kids. It's how you can get to the EPA documents that explain a lot of this stuff in detail. So I've been working in Arizona on commenting on pesticide registration review now, as I said, for about 20 years. We provide EPA with detailed pesticide use data. We know, for example, which crops a pesticide is used on and whether it's used at full rate or not. We go and we talk to the growers, pest control advisors to find out why a chemical is important or if there are alternatives. And then we put together comments and we submit that to EPA. Now, all of this is coordinated through a process through the Western IPM Center. So I actually get some of my financial support comes through the Western IPM Center, and I'm responsible for the Desert Southwest states, not just for Arizona. And we did an analysis of comments that were submitted throughout the entire Western region. There's other comment coordinators, as we call ourselves, up in the Pacific Northwest, in the Pacific Islands, and California. We've got one in Utah now. But this pie chart kind of shows the impact of our comments. We looked at 85 comments between 2012, 2021, and all of this green slice here plus the blue slice, 89% of the time, EPA made use of our information and it was considered in the registration decisions. Now, I had a very high bar for the blue slice. Those are instances where EPA used our data and identified a certain way that our data impacted their process. So, for example, they ran revised risk mitigations or revised risk analysis, I mean to say, based on lower use rates or what have you. So we're pretty proud of this, showing the outcomes of all the work that's been done in the West on pesticide policy. So this is just a quick glance at our web page. I maintain a web page for pesticide reviews. Currently, there's one open comment that's listed up here that's due on October 24th. And you can see we've had a lot of deadlines that have just recently passed. And this one here was for the draft insecticide strategy. We also have a searchable archive up here that we have over 200 comments that we've submitted, or Arizona Farm Bureau, who we partner with, has submitted. I want to promote my pesticide registration newsletter. This is how our folks find out about any of the chemistries that are important. We check the data and we identify, are these important to us? And if they're being used, then they go up on my newsletter. Here's the deadline to submit comments. Here are the proposed label changes that EPA is talking about. So I scour through hundreds of pages of EPA documents and try to provide brief summaries, and people find that useful, as you can see from our evaluation of this effort. I like to highlight the one right on the bottom, that 80% of our respondents feel more empowered to influence policy decisions at the federal level. And that's both through the information that we provide, but also through the resource of our website, which serves as a hub. People don't have to navigate the regulations.gov website. If they want to comment on a specific chemical, they can go right from our webpage to the page where they can submit a comment. And so it just makes it easier for people. So I'd encourage you, if you want to get on that email list now, no guarantee that I'm looking at the same pesticides that might be important in some of the other areas of the country, but sometimes I am. And that's my last slide. And with that, I really would like to thank the committee again for having me. I want to thank the Western IPM Center and also the Arizona Specialty Crop Block Grant Programs, a lot of support that we've had through them to develop the website and to keep these resources available for people. And with that, I'll say thanks and I'll turn it back to the moderators. Hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Al. That was great. Yeah, we do have time for questions, and people have been throwing them in the question box. So I will work through those questions with you now.
Should I leave the slide up here to give people a minute to
Yeah,
get
if you
information?
want to, that slide works because we'll kind of go to the next one.
Oh, that's right.
The
Okay.
questions, yeah, if that
Sure.
works for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so the first question is from John McLaughlin, mentioned that the Supreme Court seems to be seriously limiting the EPA. What legal steps are being instituted to counteract this?
Oh gosh, I'm not really sure of the specifics there, John. The Supreme Court's doing all kinds of things right now, but I'm not sure. I really don't have a good answer for that question. So we're not off to a good start. I do know that I feel that EPA has a good plan in hand. And the other thing I would say about that, I think I didn't say it earlier, is that we're uh, we're a little more than a year ago, they still had something like 24 lawsuits against them. As of a couple months ago, they only had one, I think, that was related to Endangered Species Act. And a lot of that, I think, is because, they really are they are stepping up and they're showing their plan for, how they're doing this now. So some of that pressure seems like it's been relieved, but I'm not sure what's going on up at the Supreme Court.
Great. Okay. Mark Imlay commented that he finds that usually the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Ag must both be consulted because they have very different experiences. Do you find this to be true?
Yeah, I think so. Departments of Ag are going to be a very big part of this, of course, on the ground because they're the ones responsible for implementation and enforcement of all this. And from what I've heard from our colleagues, and I haven't had a very recent conversation, but it seems like there's really still a lot up in the air for how the state departments of agriculture and state lead agencies are dealing with this. And yeah, conservation, it is. They're separate in Arizona too. And so those are probably two discussions.
Dolores Pino asks, wouldn't transitioning to organic agriculture and helping and supporting farmers to do so, including reducing corporate grown food, needs to be done as well, be better for everyone, including the humans, especially children who eat that crop food that has been grown with toxic chemicals? If those chemicals harm endangered species, this means they also harm human health, correct?
Well, and I'll answer the last point first. Maybe often that's true. It's not necessarily true. Remember that listed species includes both plants and animals. And what we see if we look at any given chemistry and you look across the different categories, the different taxa, the impacts can be quite different. But I want to go back to your main question because I do love it. And it reminds me of something that I should have said and forgot to say that both the herbicide strategy and the insecticide strategy focus on conventional herbicides, conventional insecticides. So those organic materials that are used are not a part of this. And so to answer your main question, an increase in organic approach agriculture, it seems to me from where EPA is right now on this, that would make it easier for growers to implement a lot of this because a lot of that, at least so far, has been outside of what EPA has been examining and implementing here. Thank you for bringing that up because I should have mentioned that.
Melissa Clemens asks, how are the mitigation points used?
Right. So the mitigation points that I talked about are specific to the runoff and soil erosion, right? So talk you through it. So to use pesticide X, you're going to need to have, let's say, 6 mitigation points. So the grower is going to be responsible for identifying what conditions or mitigation practices they've adopted that ensure that they're at that point level. And the points are, they correspond to EPA's analysis of how much these different practices would reduce the runoff or erosion. And so EPA kind of came up with a system, and they simplified it between the draft and the final herbicide strategy, for how they calculate all of that. So that's what the relief points are. You get some of them for the conditions around the field and in the field, maybe. You've got sandy soils, you get some points, right? And if you don't have enough points based on the existing conditions, you need to look at that mitigation menu and maybe adopt another practice to get the number of points for a particular spray. I hope that helps.
Great. Mark Imlay asked if we are including both federally listed endangered species and state or county listed species.
That's a great question, Mark. I've been asked this question before. You're right that those species lists are maintained sometimes at the state level, and sometimes tribes also have their species list. I don't know what the current status of this is. I know that people at those levels are advocating, but my understanding is that EPA has been working from the federal endangered species list. And this is the one that the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife are working from. But it is a great question. I think, it kind of makes sense. They need to work from a single list, but people working at the state or at those tribal levels may need to advocate to get those species added to the main list, I think is probably how it would need to happen. I don't know if there's any discussions about incorporating other lists or not.
John McLaughlin commented that this is a fine presentation for agricultural chemicals. How about industrial? Do you know of any resources?
That's a great question, John. I think he's talking about industrial use of chemicals, not urban use or something like that. Is that right? Um, my understanding of EPA's process is they're starting with agriculture because that's where they have the most information and data, and that's where most of the pesticides are used. I for Pesticides used in industrial process, this is very pesticide specific. So if there's chemicals used in industry that are not pesticides, they wouldn't be addressed through any of EPA's work. There's a separate office at EPA, right, that deals with toxic chemicals that are outside of the pesticide category. I don't know if I'm quite understanding the question. I don't, so I, Let us know if we answered it. I don't know if you're dealing with a different office at EPA, or if you're actually talking about pesticides that are used in an industrial way. Um, then, like if they were pesticides that were applied outside of industrial buildings, those aren't really being addressed as of yet. But as I say, as EPA moves forward, I expect they'll know what the risks are, and I think the mitigations will apply more broadly uh, beyond agriculture, as time marches on. They're really using agriculture to figure it all out as a starting point.
An anonymous question, if all my neighbors are farmers, farm fields, do I need a buffer zone?
That's a great question. I think you do. Um, it would come down to that. I'm basing it on what EPA has laid out here, and it would come down to that definition of managed environment. Now, there's a lot of fine print on some of this that I haven't looked at in quite a while, but I know one thing is that it says, well, buildings, that are nearby, those are included in those managed areas, but there is a requirement those buildings be vacant um, when sprays are being done, or at least certain sprays. So I don't know what the situation is for you now, but yes, I feel like you need and deserve a buffer if you're right next to there. Now, that being said, I would hope that a lot of this effort aimed toward keeping the chemical on the field is going to be beneficial to people in a situation like yours. But um, it seems like if you've got people, you've got pets, yeah, that's already covered on the label. They're not allowed to do those sprays when people are potentially impacted are right there in the area. So guess that's the best I can do on that one.
Great. We've got a lot of questions. I'm not sure if we'll quite get to all of the rest of them here. We've got maybe another 3 or 4 minutes. Let's see. Would you see BLT being expanded to include other pesticide use cases, urban, public health, et cetera?
I don't know whether EPA has specifically mentioned that, but I think it would absolutely make sense. I mean, it's the same map, it's the same United States, and, it would make more sense to do that expansion than to try to create something different. A lot of work has gone into that.
Lisa Stahl commented that the mitigation strategies appear to be addressing surface water issues mainly and physical drift. What about groundwater concerns? This relates to the mitigation strategies where predominantly sandy soils would give you 2 points. Is it not really a concern with the Endangered Species Act?
That's an excellent point. Um, yeah, you make me want to go back and look because there really hasn't been that I can recall that groundwater focus in what EPA's been doing here. And it makes perfect sense, particularly, maybe for aquatic species, that that could be an issue for some listed species. So I don't know if it's a gap. I actually want to go back and search for groundwater in back in those strategy documents and see if I've missed something on that, because I think that's a very valid concern.
We can definitely send you these questions, Al, that came in.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. I think I've just got like two quick ones here. I'm trying to jump around a little bit. When are these measures going into effect for the ornamental industry, greenhouse and nurseries?
EPA hasn't addressed that question yet. Looking at the timeline of what's on the table, they've done the herbicides, they're working on the insecticides, they're going to release the fungicide strategy this year. Um, those are the big pieces. Um, I think EPA maybe did address this, but I think it's at least another calendar year down the line. I don't have an exact answer, but I think if you go to EPA's Endangered Species website, that was one of the links that I listed, the third link, or if you just search Endangered Species Act EPA, you'll find it. Their main homepage. You might find some resources there that include like a calendar of their Endangered Species Act activities, and you'd probably find it on there. I don't think it would need to be awfully far. They've really been going fast. But as far as when the actual practices would be implemented, it happens chemistry by chemistry as EPA does those reviews and as the labels get changed. Yeah, and when that's going to extend to those other areas, uh, probably not too long, but it may have a couple years.
Okay, one last question, and then I want to make sure we get to our last slide. Heather Leach asked, will processors be held responsible for keeping track of these records, points, et cetera? Do you know if USDA audits like GAP and Primus will include this as part of their audit process?
Okay. On the first part of that, the language is really interesting in this strategy because EPA is saying it's like they're saying, you need to do this stuff, but they're saying you don't need to necessarily communicate that back to us. But the assumption has always been that the enforcement falls at the state level with the state lead agencies to figure out, how to ensure that compliance. I think I need you to reread the question, Marty, because I think I lost my thread of thought there.
And let me see, I just moved it.
Oh, sorry.
Moved it over
I'm
here.
so
Oh,
sorry.
that's okay.
I
That's
want to
what I
make
get,
sure I
right?
addressed it. Yeah.
Will processors be held responsible for keeping track of these records, and will it be required on these audits like USDA audits like GAP and
Yeah.
Primus?
I would certainly think the answer to that's got to be yes, but I think that all that enforcement is going to happen at a local level, whether it's through those USDA audits or whether it's through the state lead agency or both, you know, um, uh, it's going to be important to maintain those records.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to pivot. If you want to go to the next slide, Al, thank you so much for answering these questions. We can send you the rest of them. I'm not sure. There were a lot of good questions came in, but I did want to just take the last 2 minutes here and thank everyone. Thank you, Al. Thank you to everyone who joined today. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, the webinar, we're kind of using this as a promotion for the next International IPM Symposium, which is going to be happening March 3rd through the 6th of 2025 in San Diego. And these are just some opportunities for you that if any of you want to do one or all, you're welcome to. You could submit an abstract for a poster. The poster session is a prime opportunity to share your IPM work. Your poster abstract would be published on the symposium website, and you would gain international exposure to leading IPM scientists, students, and industry leaders. And we're currently, that is open. I think we can throw in the chat a link to our website, which will take you to the call for posters, and that goes until November 8th. That'll be open until November 8th. You're welcome to volunteer on one of our committees or volunteer at the actual event. We'll also throw this SurveyMonkey link in the chat, which is you can just fill it out, and there's a lot of prompts for how you might be interested in learning more or getting involved. And of course, you're welcome to attend the event. Registration is now open. And again, we threw the link to the website in the chat, and it's constantly being updated. We're about to put the programming in there, and you can register and find out more about what is going on and hopefully be able to attend the next IPM Symposium. So thank you, Al. This webinar was recorded, and for all of you that registered, you'll be receiving an email with the recording link. Our next webinar will be a collaboration with the EPA on November 19th at 1 p.m. IPM for Arborists and Foresters with Gary Lavallo and Marcia Anderson. So please keep your eye out for more information on that. Thank you all and have a great day. Thank you, Al.